I work at Edge Hill University, which you might not have heard of. It's in Lancashire, and it's in Ormskirk. And I'll start, before I get into the talk, saying something about what we do there, and saying something about the field in which I work, which is critical animal studies, because I want it to be known about, that if you want to do work in a university, academic work, or if you want to do a PhD, there are vegan academics who will work with you, and it's already happening. Okay. So we have something which is quite unique in the UK at Edge Hill University called the Centre for Human Animal Studies. We are small, but all good things hopefully start that way. And we have basically, so here, this is Professor Claire Malloy, and we have 3 PhD students all doing vegan-related PhDs. One is doing PhD on representations of veganism in the media. One is doing a PhD on trying to formulate what vegan art practice might mean. So to not use animal materials in art practice. And another one who's recently started is doing a project on veganism and all issues related to global hunger and malnutrition. Okie dokes. So the field is sometimes called human animal studies. It's also typically called critical animal studies. And here's a rough definition of what critical animal studies means. So the interdisciplinary study of the social, cultural, and ethical dimensions of human-animal relations from a critical pro-vegan perspective. So I'm a sociologist, but there are people from all other disciplines becoming involved in critical animal studies. And it's kind of the child of the 1970s work which emerged. You're probably, many of you are familiar with the books that came out in the 70s, such as The Case for Animal Rights by Tom Regan, and Peter Singer's work, and then how that evolved in the 90s with feminist work on animal ethics. And animal studies started to become a thing, become spoken about as a distinct field at the turn of the century, basically. And now we're beginning to really grow. It's actually hard now to keep up with all the books that are coming out in critical animal studies. These are some books which I've been involved with the last few years. This is the newest one, Meat Culture, one on ecofeminism, and some other ones there. I've actually got a couple of copies of this edited book, which came out in 2014, The Rise of Critical Animal Studies, and I'm going to give them away for free at the end of my talk. So I'll just randomly ask who wants a copy at the end, and I'll just give them out because I don't want to do the merch thing. Other books, important books in the field of critical animal studies, include some of these. So I'm going to mention, because some of these people are here today, Matthew Cole, and Kate Stewart, who unfortunately, as you just heard, was taken ill, but Matthew Cole is sitting near the front, just there, and they wrote together this important book on our children and other animals, which part of that book is looking at the socialization of speciesism, essentially. And I'm going to mention this one as well, Animal Liberation and Atheism, because Kim Sosha is also speaking at this conference, I think by Skype. Which is wise given the carbon footprint of flying here from the States. Okay, so I just that's that little part of the intro, because I want people to be aware that there is this field within academia that exists, and it is intersectional, and if you can, if you're in a position to go to university, could talk a lot about that, but it's good to know that exists, and there are people that you can work with in the academy. Okay. So my talk is in two phases, really. I'm going to spend the first part of the talk talking about research I've done into vegan transition, and this is my theory of how, well, it's one theory that I'm putting forward, is how we might understand the process of vegan transition, what happens when people become vegan. And I've been interviewing, over the last few years, lots of vegans about their own experiences of vegan transition. And then I want to relate it to the theme of today's conference, which is obviously intersectionality. So what is intersectionality, and my aspects of intersectionality shape the likelihood of transition, make some transitions more or less likely. So that I'll get to that towards the second part of the talk, and hopefully there'll also be time for Q&A at the end of that as well. I interviewed 40 vegans in Manchester, Lancaster, where I live, and Glasgow. And I recruited them via various ways, and unsurprisingly, I suppose, it was quite a gendered, racialized, and classed sample. It was a small sample, kind of reflected in the Ipsos Mori poll of this year, which seemed to also suggest quite a gendered and maybe less classed, but certainly a racialized profile of vegans in the UK. We'll come back to those points much later. When interviewing vegans, I focused on their personal narrative of transition, gave them an opportunity to tell me their own stories about how they came to veganism. And I was interested, really, like how do people do veganism on an everyday basis? I have some knowledge about this myself. I've been vegan for 11 years, but I wanted to hear it from other people. And I was also very interested in the relationship dimensions of vegan transition and being vegan. And it did turn out that was a very sort of fertile part of the data in which, as we'll see a little bit later, that was the hardest part of transition for many people, the responses that they received from non-vegans. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so I'm interested in what we can learn from people's stories of transition. I think that potentially all our stories can help construct a theory of how transition happens in everyday life. And if we have some kind of theory of transition, we can hopefully put that into practice and intensify transition on a societal basis. That's the idealistic dream. Okay. So I'm going to say something about the theory initially, and it comes from a body of work by social scientists, and it's called practice theory. And I was reading about it, and I thought this is a really interesting theory. I wonder if we could apply it to food, and specifically whether we could apply it to vegan transition as well. And it tends to be critical of strategies of intervention which focus on trying to persuade individuals to change, this kind of attitudinal perspective. And this is deemed problematic because it takes the view that people don't act rationally, necessarily, in everyday life, and we're not autonomous. We're influenced by the relationships we're embedded in. We're influenced by the kind of meanings that we get from social institutions and society, and it's not as if we can just one day decide to act rationally and autonomously, at least in many cases. And it fails to understand how behavior is socially embedded in the routines, norms, and infrastructures of everyday life. It becomes locked in very much. So, according to practice theory, if we were taking that perspective, it would view animal consumption like this. We follow particular practices, such as practices of animal consumption, partly because they're part of the dominant social fabric. We're socialized into them. It's not that people are necessarily bad people. To change that, you need a more detailed understanding of the elements of a practice, and this is what practice theory does. It breaks a practice down into 3 types of elements, and I'm going to come to those on the next slide. And what we have to do, according to practice theory, is to try to create new social norms, new routines, and new infrastructures. And these are things that are already happening with veganism, albeit at quite a low level. So for practice theorists, we should intervene more on the practice and less on the level of the individual if we want to achieve systemic societal change. Okay, so I said that practice theorists divide a practice up into 3 elements, and these are those. So they're divided up into competencies, like forms of know-how and abilities, meanings, the kind of meanings which surround a given practice, and materials as well. So the stuff of a practice. So that could, obviously, with veganism, it's a lot of that is the food, but not just the food, it's other things as well. And one of the key books in practice theory is this one here by an academic at Lancaster University called Elizabeth Shove. It's called The Dynamics of Social Practice, Everyday Life and How It Changes. So it's a theory of social change, which I think should be of interest to us. And they say in that book that generally practices emerge, persist, shift, and disappear when connections between elements of these three types are made, sustained, or broken. So if we want veganism to become socially embedded, we need strong links between these three elements of, in our case, vegan practice. Okay. So what I did following the interviews with 40 vegans was to try to discern from talking with vegans what might come under these headings, what might be vegan competencies, what forms of know-how are required to become vegan, what are the sort of meanings around veganism or meanings generally around food that are important, and what's the material aspect of veganism. Okay, so I'll go through those three. And here are some of the things that were important for some people. So for some people, new cooking skills were an important form of know-how. A use of new foods and recipes. An interesting finding was that actually often veganism is represented as a restrictive diet. What I found actually, for most people, it was actually an expansive diet. People would try new foods that they never had tried before. A literacy of animal ingredients was something that was important. So one kind of practice of veganism is ingredient checking in shops, and so you had to know actually a whole list of ingredients that you might not have been familiar with before, which are actually animal-derived. Knowledge of local food sources, including restaurants, how to exist as a vegan when traveling, which was one other hard thing that people reported. How to coexist in a non-vegan world, that's the relationship dimensions. And also, most people reported taking an interest in nutritional knowledge and learning a few things about that, because they might have had concerns, or relatives might have had concerns, as you may be familiar, that they were going to miss out on some key nutritional aspect of their diet. I should say I am focusing on food. I don't think veganism is reducible to food, but in terms of this theory of transition, I am focusing on food. Okay, so that's competency. Now meanings, and I've split this into two slides because I think it's perhaps the most important element for veganism, because there's a whole array of meanings which veganism has to contest to even begin to be taken seriously. So this slide alerts us to some of these. So our culture has many positive stereotypes of animal consumption. It is still the dominant practice. Meat as an assumed part of a meal, associations between meat and masculinity, as you may well have encountered, associations between meat and strength, also indeed between meat and notions of national identity. And there's just this idea that eating meat is part of a natural order, and even it's part of what it means to be human. Okay, so these are some of the really intransigent meanings that veganism is up against. And we also have a social norm that views food choices as private or personal, and this is something that veganism has to overcome and say, well, actually, you know, taking a nod from feminism, that the personal is very much political, and what we eat is one of our main connections with the non-human world, and so of course it's going to be political, and you can't hide behind this screen of it being a private choice. Okay. And we're also up against, obviously, negative stereotypes, negative meanings of veganism as involving, you know, austerity, restriction, weakness, being extreme, involving, you know, some kind of sacrifice in your life. Of course, meat really involves sacrifice, right? Okay, so and the vegan as other, as strange, and as some kind of killjoy. And I've written a paper on the vegan killjoy, which you can find free online. Okay. But so veganism comes along and actually reinvents these meanings and puts forward its own positive representation. So here we have veganism as healthy, as ethical, strong and pleasurable, ethical arguments for veganism, for the moral considerability of animals. Why eat animals when there is no need? Why be part of a violent system? Food practices are not private, but they're political, they have impacts. And veganism, as we heard in the last talk, has positive associations with peace, with non-violence, and with a sustainable way of living. And vegans are also involved in contesting the meanings of what is good nutrition. So nutrition is a very politicized scientific field, and it's one in which I think we need to be active in, and we already are, of course, active in. Okay, so that's competencies and meanings. We come now to the third element in the practice, which is materials. So this refers to vegan food itself, the taste, the price, the availability, activities of experimentation and creativity, also vegan food substitutes, and I've just written a paper on vegan substitutes. Infrastructure, so the whole systems of distribution, shops, events such as today. We're part of the vegan infrastructure of British society by coming to this festival today. And the food economy, obviously. And then we can begin to see that there are links between the different elements, so we can think of some links between materials and competencies. So there are some materials that we use in our everyday life which help us with our vegan competency as well. So many of you might have this in your kitchen. This, I know I do, and it's a very useful nutrition guide. And vegan guides, and most of us use websites and blogs, things like Happy Cow, to sort of navigate ourselves around the vegan world. Okay. So in this table just sort of summarizes those three elements of vegan practice, and what I found from my interviewees were the important dimensions of those. So I'm interested in this because it can potentially inform some kind of guide to transition as well. So we need to ask, what is it that binds these elements together? What makes for a strong practice? And one answer to this question is that elements come into play with each other and practices emerge via social relationships and interaction. For example, where we see sub-practices of sharing, of emulating, communicating about a practice, instructing, and demonstrating. So it's exciting to talk about this at an event like this, because this event is very much part of the internal workings of vegan practice. So events like today do all these things. They're about sharing, they're about emulating, communicating, instructing, and demonstrating. Another example would be a vegan potluck, which, if you ever hold a potluck, definitely invite people who are not vegan to it, because it sort of defeats the purpose if you don't. Elements can change the practice overall. So in a paper that I've just written about meat and dairy substitutes, I know there's a lot of conflicting opinion about these substitutes, and some people are quite against them, but from one perspective, they render vegan eating familiar and continuous, and so they could be one example of a material element which actually aids the overall practice because they make transition easier for some people, at least initially. Okay. And another thing that's important is a strong community of practice. So if you compare veganism with other practices such as, for example, cycling, maybe. So cycling is also a low-carbon practice and does have forms of community organization, but I think veganism is quite special in the sense that a lot of vegans are actively involved in the community and actively sort of agitating for the practice to become adopted by more people in a way that isn't necessarily characteristic of all practices. Okay, and practice theorists think about potential dynamics, how practices become socially consolidated. So these three elements can change and be recrafted. Elements can be better connected, or more negatively, the connections between them can erode. The population of what they refer to as carriers of the practice can also change. So something that the community of practitioners do might change the practice for better or worse. And the way in which one practice connects to others can change. Think about other practices veganism is associated with or connected to. This can draw new practitioners in because people may be involved in the other practice but not the veganism. And I put vegan runners up as an example, just one example. There's lots of other ways in which veganism links to other practices, but it could be an example of exposing veganism to the wider running community. Okay? And of course, if anybody here is a member of Vegan Runners, you'll know that the membership has something like trebled in the last couple of years to now over 1,000 members, which making it one of the biggest running clubs in the UK. Okay, not everybody can run, not everybody is interested in running, and you know, there's obviously potentially ableist concerns there as well, but you know, it's just one example I'm giving of the way in which veganism interlinks with one other practice. Okay, and we are beginning to see vegan normalization in our society. It's happening slowly. We can think about media coverage. I know there's some people in the audience who know Glasgow quite well, and even there's somebody in the audience who's involved with several vegan restaurants in Glasgow, so knows this particularly well. So yeah, coverage of particular cities and what how vegan or not they are. Social media like Instagram. This snapshot was taken some time ago. The number of hashtagged vegans or veg or what vegans eat on Instagram is now in the several million. And we see normalization also in new spaces in supermarkets, such as the wide range of plant-based milks. Don't worry, I'm not an uncritical advocate of supermarkets. I'll have something to say about that later. And of course, everybody is probably familiar with Sainsbury's bringing out its own range of vegan-friendly cheese, which through some strange social media conversation has been named Gary, which is kind of strange. Certainly, yeah. Actually, this time last year, Gary Francione spoke in this very same room. Okay. So is vegan transition easy or difficult? A surprising number of my participants in my study used the word easy or easier than I thought when describing their transition. There were two overall dimensions that were named as difficult or hard, and one of them, as I said earlier, was the social response of people to you becoming vegan and handling that, handling all the stereotypical inquisition and questions that vegans typically receive, and also being vegan outside one's geographical comfort zone. There are also ways to approach that as well. However, what I want to say, and I'll come back to this a bit later, is that ease or difficulty may also be shaped by intersectional concerns. So just because you might have found your vegan transition relatively easy, in quotes, that might be related to forms of privilege and those sorts of things. So I'll come back to that point a little bit later. Okay. So it's not apparently about getting up every morning at 5 a.m. and milking your almonds. Apparently that isn't the hardest part about being vegan, but obviously that does take its toll on many of us. And it is, in fact, actually, and here's a meme, I didn't write this. Yeah, so this seems to express the hardest part of being vegan for some people. I'm not, there's potentially something wrong with that language in terms of, ableist language. Maybe we should be kinder to our non-vegan friends and not call them idiots, but maybe just not enlightened yet, okay? So one of the other things that emerged from the data was that we see sorts of different acts of boundary maintenance and cohabitation strategies when people are living either in mixed omni-vegan relationships or households which are not purely vegan. And we see what we call micro-geographies. So how is the space of the house managed when you're living, when you're relating on an everyday basis with non-vegans? So I saw from my participants things like separate shelves in the refrigerator, separate utensils, which is an example of disconnected materiality, referring back to the language of the elements from before, separate cooking times, which impacts upon eating together, or perhaps in mixed relationships, a no meat in the house rule. And some of these things might be familiar to some of you. But we see also relationship readjustment, mixed relationship negotiations, a higher degree of planning required to maintain communal eating practices with omnivores, feelings of social distance from omnivores, expressed preference for vegan sociality and vegan sexuality, i.e. a preference for just having vegan friends or vegan partners as a further form of boundary maintenance. And these are probably terms or ideas that you're quite familiar with. So this gives some idea of some of the social problems of vegan transition. And we can represent them in terms of a kind of continuum of boundary strength from things like separate shelves on the left-hand side all the way to this idea of vegan sexuality. Okay. So in spite of the negative initial reaction, most vegans interviewed reported that the situation improves over time. And one theme was the emergence of non-vegan vegan advocates or non-practicing practitioners, as I've called them, peripheral practitioners who also actually inadvertently promote veganism without themselves being vegan. So as a demonstration of care, friends and family members will often start to demonstrate aspects of vegan practice, such as food provision, restaurant checking in advance, vegan cooking, eat vegan more often, and research into veganism. And interestingly, I think this provides peripheral ambassadorial support for the normalization of veganism, even though a commitment to vegan meanings is lacking. And I'll come back to the diagram of earlier and give an explanation as to why these people are not vegan yet. Okay, so why are these people, why are non-practicing practitioners not yet vegan? I'm suggesting, going back to this diagram, that they're learning elements to do with competency and the materiality of veganism, but they're not making any particular strong connections with the third element of the meanings. So these are like your friends and family who go out of their way to help you, but they're not really getting the ethics. They're not really getting the reason why you're vegan. And similarly, we might offer an explanation using this very simple diagram of the vegan curious as well. So I would say they're almost the opposite. They do have some kind of sympathy to the meanings of veganism, and this might be, they might be environmentalists, or they might be associated with some other justice cause, but they don't really know how to go about becoming vegan. So they have the meanings, or some of the meanings, but they don't have the strong connections with the competencies or the materiality of the practice. So that might be one way in which this sort of approach to thinking about vegan transition is useful for explaining those people who are potential vegan practitioners in the future. Okay. Right, so that's kind of like the halfway point, although I don't know if that maps onto time, it might not. I'm now going to speak a little bit about intersectionality, and then I'll bring that back to thoughts on transition, and I'll finish the talk by saying something about the relationship between veganism and capitalism. Okay. So I think that there are three senses in which we might think of defining intersectionality. This might not be complete, I'm not arguing for completeness. So firstly, intersectionality can be seen as a theory of subjectivity, as a lived experience, and this is one sense in which it's spoken about in the academic literature. So we are all partly constituted by mutually reinforcing categories of, for example, gender, race, class, sexuality, age, disability, but also species. So we are privileged and powerless in various ways, or we are, maybe a better way of putting that is we are privileged or disempowered in various ways. A second sense of intersectionality is that it's a theory which asserts that different oppressions are interconnected in certain ways. Historically, they share elements with each other. So we know from the study of oppressions that capitalism informs patriarchy, and it informs colonialism, and it informs speciesism. Patriarchy shapes the experience of classism and racism. Speciesism has shaped our understanding of gender, race, and class. These are all, there's big literatures on all of these things, and critical animal studies especially is interested in the last one there. And thirdly, intersectionality is a theory of political strategy. So political resistance intersectional people, advocates say, should proceed from the realization that oppressions are interconnected, and we should then argue for intersectional activism. I think the mic's died. Don't know. Maybe. Okay, it's still working. Good. Right. So, in thinking about where the idea has come from, this slide gives a brief historical context of intersectionality. So I think, and again, this is just my take on it, I think you could probably construct other histories of intersectionality as well, but I discern 3 different historical strands emerging in the 1970s, and Roger, I think, was correct to say in the previous talk that even earlier than the 1970s. But the writing became more pronounced, I think, and then leading through into the 80s and 90s. So definitely black feminism, and the first, it's my pointer that's gone, I think. Yeah, it's okay. So the first image there on the left is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's credited with coining the actual concept of intersectionality. But black feminism had already emerged before the early 90s when she wrote that paper. So the second image is of Bell Hooks, and the third image is of Patricia Hill Collins, all key people in black feminist thought and also intersectional thinking as well, also thinking about class, actually. Another strand which also emerged in the early 1970s was environmental racism. So saying that there's a connection between the domination of nature and racism. And environmental racism in particular referred to the propensity in the United States but also in other countries as well for example, toxic waste dumps to be more likely to be located near areas of ethnic minority populations. And I'm still reading about that finding in the news today. So there's also environmental classism is another aspect of that as well. And that picture is of Robert Bullard, who's one of the key writers over the decades in environmental racism. And thirdly, a strand that we have to talk about in the history of intersectionality is that of ecofeminism. And this is the one that I've worked the most on, and my PhD was on ecofeminism. And the first image there is of Val Plumwood, the late Val Plumwood. She was an Australian philosopher. And then you might recognize Carol Adams there, obviously the author of The Sexual Politics of Meat. And also the final image there is of Greta Gard, another American important ecofeminist thinker who specifically related ecofeminism to the question of animal ethics. And there are other people that could be mentioned in the same phrase, people like Laurie Gruen, for example. So at this point in time, patterns of vegan transition still reflect other relations of power. We know this because transition is disproportionately occurring amongst white, young, middle-class women, and this was sort of reinforced earlier this year by the Ipsos Mori poll in the UK, which you will have heard about it because it suggested that 1% of adults in the UK now identify as vegan, but there was other data in that poll which also pointed to its less class, I would say actually, but certainly gendered and racialized profile. So I think the class dimension is arguably slightly less accentuated, but it's still an issue. So generally, if the vegan scene is experienced as exclusionary in some way, it will work against transition. It will exclude people from the practice. And I think this applies as much to the way in which the practice is articulated in offline as well as online practice. There's obviously a huge online component to veganism, and there's lots of everyday discussion about veganism is taking place online. So if that is not intersectional and it is exclusionary, then likewise it's going to be damaging to veganism overall. Okay, so back to that question of ease of transition. So saying veganism is easy might be true for you, and remember my sample was definitely white biased and had more women in it, and it was probably, it was classed as well, but it might also be a product of privilege to say that vegan transition is easy. There may be more social costs for people who by becoming vegan are read as going against other practices or identities in terms of class, ethnicity, or religion, for example. Intersectionality, one of the lessons of intersectionality is it implies a need for empathy to difference and to not assume that your identity is universalizable across all human experience. Okay. So, a little bit on gender. We can explain the smaller number of male vegans in terms of the practice clashing with dominant social constructions of masculinity. Okay, so there's a real need for the vegan community to not take overly essentialist or biological view of gender. We need to take on board feminist insights of the social construction of gender and realize that one of the reasons that it's a sticking point for many men is that they learn a model of masculinity that does not include compassion for animals within its definition, or indeed doesn't include to a great degree care for one's health as a man as well, and that might impact upon vegan transition. More positively, male veganism can potentially reshape masculinity. Some men are doing this, and other attempts to contest masculinity may make more men open to veganism. And it would definitely say that feminism is good for veganism because feminism loosens our attachment to social constructions of gender, and we need to loosen our attachment to social constructions of gender in order to break down barriers to vegan transition. Okay. So what we find, though, unfortunately, sometimes, just because a man has become vegan doesn't mean that he doesn't then end up reproducing problematic understandings of gender. So, sometimes male vegans just become hegans, and there's no particular challenge to the meanings of masculinity in that transition. So an intersectional transition to veganism for a man must also be a transition to feminism. Okay, so just a couple of slides to go. Great. And just some observations about veganism and capitalism. So I would say in the broader context of anti-capitalism, veganism at the moment is somewhat piggybacking on capitalism right now. The normalization and growth of veganism is taking place because of some of the structures of capitalism. And we can also see this in the way in which it's just being sort of domesticated as a new niche choice. And we see, often vegan products are sort of premium products. And we're actually being exploited because we're being charged a lot of money in many cases for particular products. Capitalist actors such as supermarkets are playing a role in the normalization of veganism, and so we should reflect upon this and ask how we feel about this. Should we be suspicious of elitist exclusionary examples of veganism? Should we be suspicious of things like vegan fine dining, which are obviously examples of vegan restaurants which are charging a lot of money for food? Or should this be celebrated as some kind of normalization of veganism? So that's an open question you might want to think about. Do we need a working class veganism more obviously? We can compare this maybe with the emergence of a black or multicultural veganism. Okay. And I'll just finish by saying a few things about leaving our vegan capitalist comfort zone, which I think even VegFest probably, it's kind of part of that. So veganism is part of an animal rights movement, hopefully, which contests the commodity status of non-human animals. So we don't believe that animals are property. What if it also contested the commodity status of food itself and of workers? Okay, so this, I think, would be part of the ingredient of an anti-capitalist veganism, would actually become much more radical and contest the idea that food itself could or should be a commodity. And I think we could probably benefit ourselves by allying ourselves with right to food movements, movements for food poverty, and international movements against famine as well. So I just want to finish by saying the following. An intersectional veganism needs to take a global perspective on the food system, a perspective which is feminist, post-colonial, and anti-capitalist, and therefore against the commodification of food and the intersections between the animal-industrial complex and the production of global hunger, malnutrition, and overconsumption. And it's very easy just to become too celebratory of the relative successes of veganism as a growing practice when it might just be growing in a way which is not ultimately in line with intersectionality and not ultimately political or reflective enough. Okay, thanks very much.